mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's webcast. My name is Ben Frost. I'm the Public Information Officer of APA's Northern New England chapter and one of the coordinators of the Planning Webcast series. This series is brought to you by a consortium of over 40 of APA's chapters and divisions. The consortium itself is not affiliated with APA, but rather is a loose-knit association whose mission is to provide high-quality free webinars on topic of importance to planners that will also help them meet their certification maintenance requirements. Today is Friday, June 10th, 2016, and we will hear the presentation, Airport Land Use and Noise Compatibility. For technical help during today's webcast, please type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, and I will do my best to help you. If you have some serious technical problems, then please call the 1-800 number shown on the screen. For content-related questions related to the presentation, please type those questions in the question box, also located in the webinar toolbar on the right side of your screen. We will answer those as time allows at the end of the presentation during our Q&A period. Here's a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions, and I want to thank all of them for participating to make these webinars possible for you. And today's webcast is sponsored by the Virginia chapter of the American Planning Association. Here's a list of a few upcoming webcasts. We do have a full slate for the remainder of the year, and these are filling up fast, so if you want to attend one of these, please sign up now. Go to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast to get the full list of upcoming webinars and to register by clicking on the titles. To log your credits for today's webcast, please follow these instructions. Go to planning.org, log into your APA account, navigate to planning.org/cm, select the tab at the top, Activities by Provider, choose Virginia Chapter, and then select Airport Land Use and Noise Compatibility. You can also search by the event number 9028784. This webinar is approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. You can like us on Facebook, which is where you can get up-to-date information on upcoming sessions. We are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. You can go to YouTube and search Planning Webcast to find the complete slate of recordings over the past several years. A PDF of today's PowerPoint will be available at www.ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And now I'd like to turn it over to today's speakers, Mary Ashburn Pearson and Roy Lewis. Mary Ashburn, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Welcome everybody, and again, thanks for dialing in on a very beautiful sunny Friday afternoon. I'm Mary Ashburn Pearson, and along with my colleague Roy Lewis, we will be your presenters today. If you cannot hear me, apparently it's for some reason my voice was not loud during our setup, so if you cannot hear me, raise your hand or type in a comment, and I'll try to call in so that I can be better heard. So Roy and I are planners at Delta Airport Consultants, which is an aviation consulting firm with 8 offices around the United States. This is a representative sample of the Delta firm. And just to give you an idea of who's speaking to you today, this is Roy and myself. So Roy Lewis has 37 years of experience in the aviation industry, including airline management, airport management, and consulting. He's been doing airport planning now for 15 years, and he is very proud that 2 years ago he earned his AICP around this time. He's also an accredited airport executive, AAE, which is a very elite designation given to those airport professionals who have management experience. And this is a certification through the American Association of Airport Executives, and he is based in Delta's Charlotte, North Carolina office.
Thank you very much, Mary Ashburn. Good afternoon to everyone.
Mary Ashburn is celebrating her 8th year as an aviation planner and also prepares the majority of our environmental documentation for the Delta clients, compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. She's also an accredited planner, certified planner, AICP, lead green associate, and a certified member of the American Association of Airport Executives. She lives and works in Richmond, Virginia. As we look back, let's talk just a quick moment about our presentation last year, where we talked about the 10 things that all planners needed to know. And the list will scroll up there on all 10. I won't go through all 10, but we conducted this webinar last year through the APA also, through Virginia APA also, to basics on what planners should know about the airports in their community. And after touching on these, we had some requests to take a little deeper dive into some specific areas, and that's what we're trying to do this year. So our deeper dive, we chose compatible land use, noise, and land acquisition. The compatible land use element, things such as how to plan for land use around airports, or how to measure the incompatibility that may exist. Also, recognizing that the development of compatible land uses may actually spur economic development at the airport, and the integration of airport planning and development such that with the municipality's comprehensive plan and land use plan. All too often we see, particularly smaller communities, where the airport has been left completely out of the comp plan. Related to noise, we want to talk a little bit today about how noise is measured by the Federal Aviation Administration, and what does a flight track, quote unquote, look like, and how you might learn about those tracks as they apply to your airport, and then how to prevent and plan for noise impacts from airplanes or on surrounding communities. And then lastly, related to land acquisition, why does the airport require so much land, we're often asked, and we'll try to provide an explanation of that and what protected airspace surrounds the airport that requires so much control of the surrounding properties. We'll talk a little bit about eminent domain. We'll talk a little bit about the acquisition of aviation easements rather than acquiring property in fee simple, and also a little bit about the land acquisition that may be associated with an FAA noise compatibility program under the Part 150 program. With that, Mary Ashburn, please kick us off with compatible land use.
Thanks very much. So with airports and compatible land use, you really have to strike a delicate balance, because on one hand, the proximity of an airport, especially a general aviation airport with a lot of corporate users, the proximity to the traveler's final destination is one of the things that attracts people to air travel. On the other hand, you want to be sure the land uses surrounding airports are compatible with airport operations, of course. And keep in mind that most airports in the United States have been around, have existed since the 20s, 30s, or 40s. So you have an existing land use for decades that you're trying to work around. This is an aerial view of a general aviation airport here in Virginia. And this picture is looking north. So you're looking right now at the runway approach to runway 33. To the south, immediately adjacent to the airport, you'll see a highway interchange. And this is certainly compatible with airport operations as long as the Part 77 airspace is clear. And that's something that we're going to touch on a little bit later in the presentation. To the west, you see an airport industrial park. The industrial park's proximity, the airport's proximity to the highway and the industrially zoned land is an asset to this community because it promotes compatible land use and it can draw business. It can attract users. Where we fall short on this, and you can't quite see it from this photo, is to the north of this particular airport. There is a church and residential development immediately off of the runway end there. So how do we strike this balance between a favorable airport location and surrounding land uses? Well, as you know, the easiest and most proactive approach is to preserve and protect the airport environs. So the planning boundaries that need to be protected include the bulleted lists on this slide. Safety zones include run zones, RPZs, which we talked about in our presentation last year if anyone attended. And we'll touch on again today because they're very important. The protected area should also include standard air traffic patterns, overflight areas, which are those areas of frequent overflight which may be perceived by citizens as a nuisance. Noise contours, which are contours that represent various levels of noise extending beyond the runway. And 14 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 77 height restriction criteria, which we will also talk about in the next couple of slides. So communities should discourage the development of land uses like residences, schools, churches, hospitals, and other, quote, sensitive land uses within this area. And communities should also enact height restrictions within this area to protect the airspace surrounding airports. So what is a safety zone? This trapezoidal area in the exhibit here is the RPZ, the Runway Protection Zone, which is a trapezoidal area beyond each runway end where, for safety reasons, people and property should be discouraged for their own protection. So it depends on the FAA office that you're working with, but in general, FAA recommends that the airport sponsor purchase the land within these RPZs outright, so in fee simple, in order to ensure that it's kept clear of people and property, or that people and property are protected. Statistically, there's a much higher chance of an accident on a takeoff or a landing, meaning in the areas within this RPZ. So there's a reason why this particular area is very diligently protected. Okay, so standard traffic patterns in your airport. How do you know what the standard traffic pattern even is at your airport? Well, if your airport is a towered airport, if there's an air traffic control tower there, you can contact the tower and they will inform you of the standard traffic pattern. At those airports, the traffic control tower actually directs pilots as they approach and depart from the airport. So they're in communication with the pilots coming in and leaving. For airports with no towers, FAA publishes what are called approach plates, and that's what you see on the right here, this complicated drawing. And these detail the approaches available to each runway end and the appropriate flight pattern. So at a non-tower airport, there's nobody there to monitor whether or not pilots are following these prescribed traffic patterns. Some airports will post exhibits in the terminal building, and Roy will show you an example of one of these later in the presentation, to remind pilots to follow the flight paths, which are sometimes designed to avoid overflight over residential communities. Noise contours represent levels of aircraft noise in an airport, like the ones you see above, and they're generated using FAA-approved software and methodologies. And again, we'll talk a little bit in more detail about noise contours later. In this case, the noise contours remain on airport property, which is a good thing in terms of land use compatibility. And finally, Part 77 surfaces. So we introduced these during our webinar last year, but as a reminder, we've shown them to you again in both plan view and isometric view form. There are 5 Part 77 imaginary surfaces: primary surface, transitional, approach, horizontal, and conical. And the FAA has prescribed standards for the height of objects near airports in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 14, Part 77, which is called Objects Affecting Navigable Airspace. And the imaginary surfaces you see here are designed specifically to protect the critical airspace around an airport. In addition to this federal guidance, a lot of states have incorporated protective zoning for airspace around airports. I know that here in Virginia, the state has standards for the height of objects which parallel federal standards. This is what the engineers in our office call the planning level exhibit, which is a little prettier and a little easier for the layperson to understand, which I appreciate. So I thought I would show this. We showed this last year, and we'll show it again this year. This is just an exhibit depicting 2 airspace surfaces to be protected. Depending on the type of approach, there could be several other airspace surfaces and with their various slopes that need to be protected. In this case, we've shown the approach surface, the Part 77 approach surface, and then a surface called the threshold sighting surface. In this case, you can see that the approach surface is being penetrated by trees and by the roof of this residence. So the FAA will definitely require that these obstructions to airspace be mitigated. Mitigation could mean a lot of things. It could mean topping and trimming the trees. It could mean moving the residence or removing the residence. Sometimes FAA will let you light a penetration, so pop a light on top of that house instead of removing it. It depends, again, on the FAA office that you're working with. Other methods which are less favorable, but they are possible, are raising the approach minimums at the airport or even shifting or shortening the runway. The last thing about this slide is please notice how the aircraft flies significantly over the surfaces themselves. So just because the surfaces should be cleared to the property owner's trees, it doesn't mean that an aircraft is going to follow that slope and fly and graze somebody's roof. So non-compatible air land uses, if they're not protected, they will encroach on airports. So an airport overlay zone should be integrated into your municipality's existing zoning ordinance. The best way to do this, we just looked at a bulleted list of things that should be included in an overlay zone. When in doubt, just use this racetrack drawing. This is the Part 77 conical surface shown from above. You can use this drawing as the boundary for your airport overlay zone, and you should catch basically everything that we put in that bulleted list. So this airspace sheet is one of the sheets in an airport layout plan, an ALP, and your local airport, if it's federally funded, it should have a similar sheet on file that you can look at. And the good thing about this sheet is that it protects the airspace for the existing conditions, but also for the 20-year and beyond 20-year proposed development. So for example, if the airport has proposed a runway extension of 1,000 feet in the next 20 years, that airspace will be protected in this drawing. So if you use this as your zoning overlay district sheet, you should be good to go for the next 20 years and beyond. Just another quick note, just please look at the size of the airspace that needs to be protected around the runway. So you can see the skinny gray runway in the middle of this drawing here. And then look how far out this racetrack goes. So again, depending on the type of approach, this conical surface can extend anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 feet from each runway end. And at some airports, the approach surface can extend over 50,000 feet from the runway. So that's like 10 miles almost of airspace beyond the airport that needs to be protected. Some examples of airport overlay districts that we pulled from the internet, just to use as examples, you'll see Lynchburg Regional Airport here in Virginia on the left. And this air zone surface actually calls out the specific Part 77 surfaces we just talked about. And on the right is Winchester Regional Airport, also in Virginia. And this is called the Airport Safety Zone. that Frederick County has established, which discourages residential and other non-compatible land uses within this zone. As I mentioned previously, airspace can extend miles and miles beyond the airport property. So in a lot of cases, that means that these surfaces extend into your neighboring municipality. So regional cooperation is often necessary to make sure that the full airspace is protected. And some quick examples on the left, I have the zoning map of the city of Santa Monica. And I use this city as an example because we'll be talking about its airport later in the presentation. And we talked about it last year as well. It's just a very interesting case study in terms of planning, airport planning. Nobody's picking on Santa Monica. But you can see the city border, which is at the gray airport area. This is where the city ends. And so all of that white space is actually made up of 5 separate jurisdictions. So in order to protect effectively the airspace at Santa Monica Airport, coordination with 5 separate jurisdictions is needed. To the right, you have Greenville-Spartanburg Airport. This is an international airport. This is a commercial service airport in South Carolina. And the bold black diagonal line actually separating this runway is the county line between Greenville County on your left and Spartanburg County on your right. So this is an example of an airport with great regional cooperation. Both counties are pretty involved in the airport. So the purpose of these slides is just to emphasize that if you're a municipality, even if you guys act proactively and you check all the boxes and enact your zoning to protect the airspace, but you don't coordinate with or encourage your neighboring municipality to do the same, there's not much that your municipality or the FAA can do legally to prevent that Walmart or that new hotel from being developed right in the approach path to your airport. We wanted to quickly touch, we talked about these last year, but we want to quickly touch on other types of incompatible land uses. None of these should be located near an operating airport, whether it's a tall building, a pole, a tree that's been allowed to grow and penetrate the airspace, or land use that can interfere with pilot visibility, like a smokestack or a reflective solar panel. So a note on solar panels, they're not necessarily incompatible land uses, but the FAA does require a glare analysis to be conducted before solar panels are installed on airport property. Solar arrays actually can assist airports in sustainability goals, and they can help generate revenue for the airport. So they can be a very positive installation for airports. Just make sure that they've been determined not to distract operating pilots before they're installed. Also, wildlife attractants like landfills and water treatment plants should not be located near an airport because we all know that wildlife and aircraft do not mix. So beyond describing these 5 imaginary surfaces, Part 77 really is a notification device. So it describes how to determine if something is an obstruction to airspace or not. If someone in your locality is proposing a tall structure near an airport, they are required by law to submit a 7460-1 form to the FAA. And this is the form, you can Google it, it's available on the FAA's website. And it's called Notice of Proposed Construction or Alteration. So this is a form that anyone must fill out and submit for any development that will be 200 feet or taller anywhere in your municipality, whether or not it's in close proximity to the airport. Or if an object is proposed which has a height exceeding a 100-to-1 slope from the runway, or a 50-to-1 slope for runways 3,200 feet or shorter. So FAA will review this FAA 7460 form, come back with a determination of no objection, conditional determination, or objectionable. However, FAA cannot do anything to stop the construction. That is the responsibility of the locality. So one of the things that we recommend is tie the 7460 review process to your building permit review process locally, so that before you've issued a building permit, you know that the proposed development won't be an issue for your airport. And then lastly, some good sources if you're starting from scratch with an airport overlay district and you're not quite sure where to start. FAA Advisory Circular 150-5190-4A has a model zoning ordinance. It's a little bit old, but it's a good place to start. And then ACRP, Airport Cooperative Research Program, they have fabulous resources for anything relating to airport planning and design, and their report number 27 also includes a model zoning ordinance. And Roy, you can take over with noise now. Roy, you ready to take over with noise?
I'm sorry. I didn't unmute. You'll be able to hear me a lot better now, I'm sure. So moving away from the height limitation and back to the noise discussion, this graphic is depicting a series of noise contours or noise exposure maps, and we're trying to address the question here about how a planner might know if a particular land use is compatible or not. Besides the basic guidelines, planners can determine that the compatibility of specific parcels by looking at these particular contours. You see the black dashed line is actually the airport property line, and that's the first thing that an airport planner would look at is do the noise contours extend off the airport property. You see there at the lower portion of the picture they do slightly cross the area. But this happens to be the same airport that Mary Ashburn spoke to in the first slide, and by design that is an airport industrial park, and so that did not generate an incompatible land use. Obviously if that was residential butted right up against the airport property line there, an incompatible land use could exist. Noise contours such as this are created using the relatively new Aviation Environmental Design Tool, or AEDT, that replaced the Integrated Noise Model programming a few years ago. Noise in many cases is defined as an undesirable sound. Of course, that is very subjective. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes. But it's typically the most significant off-airport environmental impact that occurs. Noise, of course, is measured in decibels, but the FAA has a specific approved metric to address aircraft noise generated from an airport area, and that is DNL, or day-night average sound level. That is the average cumulative sound level that provides a measure of the total sound energy over a 24-hour period. And again, this can be very subjective, so sometimes noise might be more annoying at 2 a.m. than it is at 2 p.m. So there's a 10 decibel penalty that's applied during these calculations to any noises that occur during nighttime hours from 10 p.m. until 7 a.m. Noise for airports is generally tracked at the 65, 70, and 75 DNL levels, as you see here on the exhibit. Outside of the 65 DNL is typically viewed as compatible land uses all the way to residential. As you move inward to the 70 and 75 DNL, however, then there's more incompatible categories that are identified, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But an example would be industrial or some commercial uses, manufacturing, auto parking, so on and so forth. Obviously could be in the 70 or 75 DNL area. What about flight tracks? And what is an example of a flight track? I'm going to show you an example on the next slide, but there's a number of ways that airport management can respond to noise concerns. The smaller general aviation airports in many communities will try to do this as an initial step anyway, as encouraging their pilots to fly quietly, as you see in the sign in the background here on the left picture, or they ask for voluntary noise abatement procedures such as fly neighborly. Now a flight track, as we see on this slide, the term flight track refers to how the aircraft arrive and depart at the airport. And when the noise exposure maps are prepared, there is a very detailed review of those arrival and departure tracks, as well as any aircraft that may be operating, as they say, within the pattern, or for run-up operations. If there's a maintenance base at the airport or something, then all of that is a part of that model. We have worked with some airports, however, in trying to graphically depict for pilots a flying quiet program. So you can clearly see from this exhibit where the residential areas are, and you see that this proposed flight track, and it is consistent with FAA guidelines as far as operating at the airport, the way they should enter the flight pattern, approach to land, so on and so forth. It just increases the awareness for the pilots on how they can be more neighborly by not flying directly over densely populated residential areas. Our next graphic provides just a quick frame of reference on some things, such as one of my favorites, the dump truck at 50 feet, generating 80 decibels. Now, that would be equivalent to the noise generated by a small to medium-sized corporate jet. You can see there obviously vacuum cleaner and so on and so forth, but these are single event noise levels as far as decibels, and the average of this, of all of the airport events, are taken into consideration on the DNL metric as we talked about earlier. One common reference for anything louder than the 65 DNL is that if it interrupts conversational speech, and that's somewhere between 60 and 65 is typically where, if you're out in your backyard talking to your neighbor and an aircraft flies over and you have to pause your conversation and then continue, then that's where the true annoyance factor usually is initiated. Noise, again, as I said, are subjective. So, loud motorcycles, a Harley, for instance, is music to some people's ears. It might be noise to others. My particular best frame of reference for noise is a leaf blower before 10 a.m. on a weekend morning, or my neighbor's dog barking continuously. Airplanes flying over don't really bother me personally, of course. But our next graphic, excuse me, our next graphic is drawn from the FAA's Part 150, which the first step in a Part 150 analysis is generating those noise exposure maps or noise contours that we were talking about earlier. Part 2 of that is if those contours actually go off airport property and create impacts and generate incompatible land uses, then an airport noise compatibility plan is to be developed. And at that point in time, they would use graphical references such as this to try to determine, well, is it within an area where a church or a hospital could still exist, or should it be manufacturing or transportation operations or the like. So one more graphic on noise, and you can see here where duration really plays a role. The cars that you see on the nearby boulevard to the left are local cars going by to the right of that aircraft reference are very quick peaks of single event noise. But an aircraft overflight tends to ramp up and then ramp down. So the total duration is sometimes more annoying to the human ear than is just a car passing by. And so that's one of the reasons is that extended duration. One more point on the Part 150 study process. I touched on this just a moment ago. The blue areas at the top of this chart reference that phase 1 effort I was talking about, and then the teal areas are the phase 2 area where if an impact is determined, then mitigation plan would be developed. You see the steps that would go through that process to develop that would include public hearings and then result in a recommended noise compatibility program, which might include additional insulation for residential or commercial areas, or if the insulation wouldn't fully resolve the issue, then it could be actually acquiring those properties and relocating those residents is done quite often nationwide. With that, Mary Ashburn. Mary Ashburn, the mute button.
Hi guys. Thanks, Roy. So I showed you the city of Santa Monica's zoning map a couple of slides ago, and I thought I would return to this because, again, it's such an interesting case study in terms of airport planning, and also it's always in the news, so it's something that's right in front of our faces. So Santa Monica Airport is the oldest operating airport in Los Angeles County in California, and it dates back to as early as 1919 when it was called Clover Field. So this is Clover Field in the 1930s, and this was an airport that was used by Douglas Aircraft during World War II, and the surrounding homes that you see near the runway were built for the workers for convenience. So after the war, the city assumed ownership of the airport, and there have been noise complaints here since the 1960s when the Learjet started appearing at the airport. So the city of Santa Monica is the airport sponsor, the entity that owns and operates the airport. This is the airport today, and as you can see, this is an airport sponsor that has allowed residential and other non-compatible land uses to encroach right, literally, to the airport's door. We saw its zoning ordinance earlier, so it is very clearly allowing these residential uses in the vicinity of the airport. Look a minute at those RPZ areas that we learned about earlier and think about if you would like you and your family's home to be within those RPZ areas. So the city has been trying to close this airport for years. However, there is a catch that's keeping them from being successful. Those airports who accept federal grant monies agree to certain grant assurances, which typically endure for 20 years. So there are many grant assurances, but some examples are ensuring land use compatibility around the airport and making sure airspace is free of obstructions. And grantees are responsible for upholding these assurances for the 20-year period following a grant. So if your airport sponsor accepts federal money this year, it must honor the grant assurances attached to those funds for 20 years. And if your airport sponsor accepts another grant next year, the clock starts again and it must honor those grant assurances for 20 years after that. In the case of land or land acquisition, this responsibility lasts forever, meaning if the sponsor wants to close its airport, it must pay back the FAA at fair market value, the value of any land that it purchased in the past using federal funds. So tenants and users at Santa Monica Airport, including the actor Harrison Ford, have fought the city's attempts to close the airport. So the FAA recently ruled that the city is subject to grant assurances through 2023 because it last accepted federal money in 2003. Because it wasn't able to close the airport, the city has tried several ways to limit operations at the airport, including banning all jet operations at one point. It banned operations by C and D, larger aircraft, and it imposed weight-based landing fees for aircraft over 10,000 pounds. So all of these attempts were found by its attorneys to be in violation of these FAA grant assurances. So this is a reliever airport, which means its role is to take away some of the congestion from nearby congested commercial service airports. And one thing to note is if an airport is receiving, if it's eligible to receive federal and state funding, that means that the federal and state agencies and governments believe that it's important enough to the federal and state aviation airspace systems to exist and to be funded. So the FAA does not want to close an airport that's important to its airspace system. Airport closures are very rare. So what does this mean for you and for your community? If you're sitting there thinking, my community genuinely does not want to host its airport anymore, does that mean that we will be trapped in this grant assurance loop forever and forced to keep our airport?
Wait a minute, Mary Ashburn. Trapped, you say. The city's not the victim here. The airport is the victim. There's been this residential encroachment for years. The airport sponsor, the city or the community or the county, whoever it is, has potentially accepted millions of dollars of federal money for decades for this local infrastructure improvement and leveraged that investment like 5 cents on the dollar. The airport sponsor is completely aware of the grant assurances that were tied to these funds, and it appears they've just forgotten this as ABC developer came to town wanting to build suburban neighborhoods.
Yes, but let's say the people who made the decision to accept ownership of the airport from the federal government years ago are no longer in charge. And now everyone agrees the airport has got to go. What do we do now?
Well, number one, as you said, there has to be some attrition or some retirement of that debt. So assuming that the FAA and the aviation organizations involved would even agree to that, then they would have to stop accepting grant funds. And during that interim, while those grants are being retired, or excuse me, while that grant debt is being retired, then the facility would have to be maintained to design standards at local expense. Now, as I said, if the airport has aeronautical demand, the FAA is going to resist that closure vehemently. A functional airport with growing demand is considered a valuable element, and that's why it exists. If it were to close or cease operations in some manner, where will those planes go to? If the displaced aircraft relocate to a nearby larger airport, is that going to create or increase congestion at that airport? Is that going to cause concern or a safety hazard for passenger airline traffic? Where will medevac helicopters go? How will this loss impact economic development decisions in the area? And and God forbid a flood, quake, or a 9/11 type attack. What's the community going to feel about that airport if it is gone and all of a sudden they need it?
Okay, fair enough. So we may not want to close the airport. So in that case, what are some methods to mitigate this noise impact on nearby properties?
Well, and if it's truly noise impacts, then the noise exposure maps will document that, and then the FAA and the state agency would, support the acquisition of non-compatible land, and you would work through a noise compatibility plan, as I spoke to earlier. You could also work with the pilot community to try to ease some of that local noise from those operations. Also, waiver issues that could be, excuse me, not waiver issue, waiver of claims, so to speak. The most effective way is to put zoning in place around those airports such that the development that occurs is compatible, and if there's any residential development in the area, those buyers know up front that there's an airport nearby.
Thanks, Roy. So moving into the third topic of our presentation is land acquisition. So this is arguably the most expensive and least attractive option for airport sponsors. And as we have tried to emphasize, it's best to proactively minimize the amount of non-compatible land uses around the airport through zoning so that the need to mitigate these non-compatible land uses is kept to a minimum. However, when an airport must acquire land in order to mitigate for noise impacts or to remove off-airport obstructions to protect the RPZ or for a proposed development project, there are a couple of methods of acquisition. So this is an exhibit of an airport's proposed fee simple land acquisition plan over the planning period. Fee simple, of course, means purchasing the land outright. So look closely at the runway ends, and you should recognize the shape of the fee simple acquisition areas here. They resemble the trapezoidal RPZ. So this is an airport that did not fully control its RPZ land and is now proposing that acquisition. The rest of this acquisition is likely for airport development projects. And then here's the same airport with its proposed easement acquisition over the planning period. An avigation easement is the most commonly acquired easement. That's not a typo. It's not an aviation easement. It's an avigation easement. And this is where the airport sponsor purchases the airspace above the property while allowing the property owner to continue its current use. So, for example, a residential property will sell its an avigation easement to the airport sponsor, the county or the airport authority, and will agree not to let trees or to construct tall structures within the airport's airspace. Most of the time, obstructions to airspace are off airport property. This means that the airport needs to acquire some sort of property interest in order to mitigate the obstructions. So typically, again, that's trimming or removing trees, and they need to have the permissions, of course, to go on private property and do that. So this, as you can see, this is an airport with some existing navigation easements already in the orange, and then the proposed additional navigation easements with a ton of trees on those parcels are marked in blue.
It would be nice if the acquisition process was exactly the same at every airport nationwide, but just as any other real estate transaction is going to differ, so does land acquisition by airports and around airports. There is a very detailed and specified process that we follow to accomplish that. Certainly with the property identified, surveys being conducted, and then the environmental due diligence audit being prepared if it's a fee simple acquisition. That's not required if it's just for an navigation easement. But then an appraisal and a review appraisal process prior to the offer being prepared and submitted to the property owner. At that point in time, of course, then the property owner still has the option to refuse that offer, present a counteroffer, have their own appraisals done, or provide additional information which may somehow affect or increase the value of the property. And from that point forward, the negotiations really look like any other negotiation process that you would see in any real estate transaction until you get to exhaustive negotiations. Once you run out of exhaustive negotiations, of course, then it's up to the airport sponsor, if they have the right of eminent domain, to choose, are they going to reach deeper into their own pocket to try to resolve this matter in a negotiated manner, or are they going to exercise that right of eminent domain to condemn the property? And regretfully, that sometimes does occur. This concludes our presentation for this year, and we hope you have gained some deeper insight into our deeper dive, as we call it, for compatible land use, noise, and land acquisition. And we're available for any questions anyone may have.
Great. Thanks very much, Roy and Mary Ashburn. This has been a really interesting presentation. I'm recalling back to when I was a kid growing up on the North Shore of Boston, and Logan International Airport, which was then claimed to be the 8th busiest airport in the world, was set for a major expansion. And the only place Logan can go is in the water, because it's topographically constrained, partly by the city, but also by rivers that surround it. And I recall, in thinking of the jets that were taking off and landing at Logan at the time, 707s and DC-10s and L-1011s, big, noisy airplanes. There was a real hue and cry. In fact, it became a political movement in East Boston to push back against the expansion. Now, I know some cities, say London, Denver, for example, have essentially, and I guess Chicago too, have essentially relocated their major airports. Santa Monica, the plan view, the photograph that you showed of Santa Monica was really shocking to see the amount of building that was allowed to occur around that. But other airports like Logan, they're stuck with what they've got, and it's not likely that there's going to be another major airport built around Boston. And this gets to a question that David asks, and he asks, and I'm thinking about how this would apply to a place like Logan. Do you have any examples of a good noise abatement program? We, and he doesn't say where he is, we have a very active one, including noise monitors and a voluntary restriction from flying agreement with corporate fixed-based operators and commercial aviation users.
Well, as far as for a noise abatement procedure, I assume if he's got the noise monitors in place and already has some abatement, I mean, that's usually a development out of that noise compatibility plan from the Part 150 study. So I would assume that some point in time in the past they've had that Part 150 study completed, and that was probably the mitigation solution offered at that point in time. As you mentioned, Ben, too, though, the aircraft that we grew up with are, over the horizon, so to speak, and many of today's aircraft are much quieter. It is rare that when we run a new noise exposure analysis for an airport that their noise contours do not shrink to some extent, unless, of course, the role of that airport has changed dramatically. But to answer the question specifically, no, I don't have, noise abatement procedures are specifically tailored to the airport and the community, because you want to know where your complaints are coming from. You want to know specifically what the impact areas are, and it's going to vary depending on the operations at the airport and what the expectations of the community are. So if he's not already had a Part 150 study done and those noise exposure maps are off airport property, then that would probably be the next best step.
Another thing that he can do is the noise compatibility plans are published on the FAA's website. So if he is looking for inspiration or ideas of what other communities are doing, that's a good place to start as well. So there are all kinds of ideas like creative ideas like adding insulation to homes within the 65 DNL contour, or installing vegetative walls to absorb noise. So there are all kinds of things that can be done.
Great, thanks. And this is kind of a follow-up also from David. He asks, can you discuss aircraft noise, particularly improvements in technology over the past couple decades, and I would say more importantly, and improvements in technology looking forward that might address noise generated from aircraft? What are the prospects?
Right. Well, over the last couple of decades, obviously, I mean, again, when you tie back to the first reference you used, Ben, was like Boeing 707, which had the old Pratt & Whitney JT9D engines on it with very low bypass ratios, and is, as you'll recall, starting in the 1980s and certainly all through the 90s, the thing that changed a lot of that was the high bypass ratio engines, and that's why you have these huge cowlings around the jet engines currently, is because you're bringing in 6 or 7 times or greater more air into the intake, and that is shielding the exhaust sound, if you will, for lack of a better lay explanation, as it comes out of the rear of the engine. So that has been, at least looking back, that has been probably one of the greatest efficiency improvements in a number of different ways, but particularly for noise in aviation. Going forward, again, the technology of the jet engines just continues to improve. They're continually looking at ways to improve not only the efficiency, but reduce the noise of those. And the composite materials that a lot of aircraft are being made out of now obviously make the aircraft lighter. They perform much better in comparison to the older aircraft, so they get up and out much quicker. Also, you can think back to like the older commercial jet aircraft had a much lower takeoff slope, if you will, as opposed to the climb out rate of some of the aircraft. So they're, another element of that is some of the procedures that the airlines use in particular now with the first and second stage climbs, that reduces that thrust noise for pure time also. Looking into the future, I mean, that's hopefully that technology will just continue to advance.
Another thing looking into the future is, if you've read anything about the next gen effort, the FAA's effort to move from a ground-based to a satellite-based system, one of the results of this will be tighter flight tracks, which means the noise should at least be concentrated over a slimmer area instead of being over a general location. So one of the effects of the Next Gen program is said to be a decrease in noise impacts to a surrounding community.
That's a very good point, Mary Ashford. And then in a final follow-up on that question, there's a number of the larger airports, the connecting hubs, including Charlotte, have been experiencing that already, in that people that were accustomed to a certain level of noise because of the next-gen routing and the satellite-based satellite-based technology approach and departure courses being much tighter, as Mary Ashford mentioned, then those people are getting much more of an intensity of those operations. So now you've got people who have never complained before that are complaining, and you've got the folks on either side of them are saying, oh yes, it's improved. Well, that's because those aircraft are on a much tighter, much narrower course for both approach and departure. So now the airport management is having to go back and purposely move some of those flight tracks out to try to diversify that a bit.
Well, and following up on that, we have a question from Joe, and he's asking along these lines, very similar to lines to what you're talking about, the concentration of flight patterns. He asks, how does this work when the flight pattern is now very uniform and goes over the same area with no variations? And he cites San Diego International Airport in particular. You know, they've got a pretty narrow approach.
Right, and that's exactly right. Then once that noise analysis is revisited with the new flight tracks, then that would be the result, you know, a new solution, if you will, that would come out of that noise compatibility plan may be properties along that narrow corridor might now be eligible for mitigation relief and purchased and relocated. And that's, you know, that's something that's already being worked out across the nation in a number of airports, and some of them are purposely moving those flight tracks on certain days of the week or spreading them, and others are looking at trying to remove those noise-sensitive areas from that narrow corridor.
Well, here's a property law question from Jennifer. Can sponsors conduct eminent domain for the airspace, the navigation easement, or just on real property? Fee simple.
No, well, I'm not a lawyer, but yes, you can condemn for navigation easements, and airport sponsors do routinely.
Interesting.
Navigation easements, just one quick follow-up to that, Ben. Navigation easements typically represent a percentage of the value of the land value of the property. So, and that percentage, depending on the height of the easement, things like that, can run anywhere from 10 to 25% of the total value of the property.
It's kind of the flip side of Pennsylvania coal versus man, the underground easements. Interesting.
Correct. Exactly. Yep.
So Dusty asks, when evaluating proposed uses on the airport, can you use less stringent local noise standards instead of FAA noise standards? Do FAA standards allow for temporary spikes in noise levels in excess of the decibel standards? For example, air ambulance, helicopter takeoff, landing?
Again, the spikes, those temporary individual spikes would occur, and depending on the other operations at the airport, they may not be significant in the calculation of the DNL for that airport. And we run into that from time to time with residents that will attend a public meeting and say, well, yes, I understand that, but, you know, when those military helicopters are flying over my house at, 2 a.m. on their practice reconnaissance missions, or when that F-16 takes off doing their night mission, it's much more annoying, or like you say, medevac or anything else. But those single event operations typically, even though they spike for that period of time, even though they might spike at night, usually the operation quantity is not significant enough to significantly change the noise contour placement.
Okay, we have a question for Mary Ashburn. Are residences and businesses located in the airport zones also subject to glare restrictions on solar panels, such as those you mentioned for the airport itself?
Oh, that's a very good question. I know, for example, a glass skyscraper has been reported, to be to impair pilot visibility and to be a safety issue. I'm not aware of a specific requirement by FAA for those types of installations, but it's a very good idea to incorporate that into your zoning ordinance. So a lot of municipalities will just list something like, no, within this overlay district, no uses which impair pilot visibility, and then it's up to your, building permit review board or whomever to make that determination. But there is a free online tool that FAA requires for solar panels installed on airport property. If solar panels are proposed in your community off of airport property, I still recommend you run the glare analysis because, again, these approaches can extend 5 to 10 miles off of airport property, so the solar panels could very well be a safety issue. So if you want to Google the software, it's made by a company called Sandia, S-A-N-D-I-A, and it's relatively easy to figure out type of software.
Great, thank you. Question from Terrence regarding the noise modeling. Do the noise contour models compensate for topography, particularly mountainous terrain? And he says clearly the distribution of jet engine noise would vary depending on whether the runway and staging areas were in mountainous versus a flat environment.
That is a very good question. I'm trying to think back as far as with the transition to the new AEDT program. I do not know. That's a very good question, and we will research that and so we can get that answer. But with the new AEDT program, I'm not sure if that's an element in that. I do not recall that it was incorporated into the integrated noise model at all. But that's a very good question. We'll ask and try to get back with an answer.
Okay, and Roy, we will give to you Terrence's contact information so you can respond to him directly. Question from Zachary. Has either of you ever encountered a municipality that actually wanted to close their airport but experienced that pushback from the FAA? And he says, I've talked with municipalities that are less than enthusiastic but cooperate with the system planning anyway. They've never actually come into contact with the airport closing process, however.
Go
ahead, Roy.
Now, I regretfully have assisted probably a handful of airports over the year with that request, yes. Once they're educated on what it's going to involve and what the impact is, we've yet to have one of those that actually proceeded with closing.
Yeah, and that's why we kind of tried to do the good cop, bad cop dialogue in our presentation, because that's a question that sooner or later, an airport sponsor may have to answer. What's the value of the airport, and what are our residents asking for, etc.
Okay, here we have a noise topology question from Gordon. Are aircraft noise generation conditions generally less near the midpoint of a runway than the aircraft noise generated near the ends of a runway?
Mary Ashburn, you want to get that?
My guess would be yes, because it's more of a taxiing operation rather than an approach or departure operation. But again, in the contours, as you saw in our exhibits, the contours are just the average sound energy coming from aircraft operating on that runway.
Yeah, I would agree that I have seen some over the years that have that kind of a barbell look to them. that they're often in many different shapes, but usually what causes the bend at the end more than anything else is the aircraft making a turn immediately upon takeoff, or either on a approach from a different route. But if you assume that the flight tracks were straight in and straight out on both ends of the runway, I think that those bulbous areas on the end would probably be much smaller.
Regarding airport closures, we have a comment here from Joe. He says Sky Park Airport, owned by the city of Santa Cruz, was closed after the city of Scotts Valley put a natural gas tank facility at the beginning of the runway. Sounds like an
that would probably do it.
Intermunicipal conflict. That's one way of doing it, I suppose.
Yep.
And we have a note here from Krishna. There was a case in Las Vegas about a decade ago where the airport authority imposed height restrictions for aviation easement. The owner of the property disagreed and filed a counterclaim for loss on the basis of the lost property use. So this is a takings claim. And he says the owner won, and the airport authority ended up providing substantially more compensation as a taking, which presumably would have been encountered if they'd taken the aviation easement by eminent domain. A question from Olivia. Any communities in Florida that serve as a good example for multi-jurisdictional planning? Our city-owned airport is physically sited in the unincorporated area of the county.
I can't think of one right now, but we'll explore that internally, and that would be another answer we'll try to get back to someone on.
Okay, great. Here's kind of an economic question from Tom. He says, many small airports depend upon corporate aviation and fuel sales to fund the base operations, which are usually done by a contractor. There have been cutbacks in the use of corporate aviation, which threatens the viability of airport operations. And the example he's citing is Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Any prognosis on the future in this regard?
The specific question again, Ben, I'm sorry.
Is that the future of fuel sales for corporate aviation?
Right. Well, I mean, for jet fuel, I mean, there's always going to be corporate jets, and that's really that's the real revenue producer. Now, when you are talking about the avgas sales and things like that, I mean, there's many different avenues being pursued right now for alternatives to that, including aircraft being built that accept unleaded automobile gas. So there's a number of different solutions being pursued for that. But the jet fuel sales is what's making the true revenue difference for those FBO operators at the airports, and that's just going to be a function of how many of those aircraft that they can continue to attract.
Right. We have a point here from David, and this gets back to your assertion, Roy, that a lot of the surrounding property owners bought with notice that there is an airport in the neighborhood. And what he says is that one of the things that we've been doing to reduce the costs associated with fee simple acquisition is to purchase the property, place an easement on it, and then put it back on the market. Are you seeing that kind of practice more widespread?
There are some, yes. There are. I have seen some airport sponsors do that, or at least one airport sponsor do that, to prevent from having to go the eminent domain route, where they were, all they needed was a navigation easement. The property owner didn't want to remain there for an easement. The easement value was like 20%, and so as I recall, the sponsor bought the property and then, as you say, placed the easement on it and then resold it. And I think someone bought it as a rental house, something, I mean, as an investment property, something like that. So, yes, I mean, that is a very good solution if the airport sponsor has the financial wherewithal to do that, yes, because that would not be something that would be eligible for FAA or state aviation funding. They would have eligibility for the value of the easement, but they'd have to produce the other 75 to 80% of those funds required out of local coffers.
Okay, we have a couple of questions here related to military uses. And one question from Galen is, how much overlap does the information you've presented today also apply to Air Force bases? And the second question from Kathy Ann is, why don't FAA regulations apply to military aircraft flying at a combined use airport?
I love this question. Guys, it's the sound of freedom. You cannot question what the sound of freedom is going to be. Now, in all seriousness, on a pure military base, then I think that's, I mean, it is considered just national, an issue of national defense, and most of those military bases have long been there. And I do know that there are noise analysis that go on through that process. I'm not specifically familiar with the military mitigation program. As far as the joint use, we're actually working on a master plan right now that involves a joint use airfield, and their mission has transitioned from F-16s to C-5 cargo aircraft and now down to C-17 cargo aircraft. And to answer the question about does it apply, yes. When that civilian sponsor of that airport conducts a master plan effort, they are producing noise exposure maps that incorporate what those military impacts are as well, and they're addressing that with the community directly. We have seen some instances where, well, and the military actually has their own, or the Department of Defense, rather, actually has their own noise analysis tool. It's referred to as Noise Map, all capital letters, and that would be comparable to the civilian INM, or now AEDT. And we recently went through this process trying to determine if it would be appropriate to map the civilian operations with AEDT and map the military operations with Noise Map, and then try to combine them. I know that's been done at a couple of airports in the Northeast, and the question for this particular client, the FAA came back and said that they wanted all civilian and military operations to use the AEDT program. So we still have a question as far as what the standard policy will be for that going forward in the future.
We have a question here from Leo, and he asks, in regards to the Form 7460 process, are the process steps indicated in your presentation today the same for all types of obstructions? And what he says is, in our state, and he doesn't say what state it is, in our state the challenge has been that the state DOT, or the county has not been able to review the Form 7460 applications at an early stage.
Oh, would you like that, Mary Aspen, or would you like me to?
We can vote. We can tag team, but I think the requirement legally for when the 7460 form should be prepared and submitted is at least 45 days before construction is to begin. Obviously, that seems a little bit late in the process, so we recommend, again, tying it to your locality building permit review process. If that answers the question, and then you can, once you get the determination from FAA, then your state or your county can take whatever necessary steps there are to prevent incompatible land uses.
Yeah, I would echo that completely regarding the building permit. That's really the key and the only way to protect all the interest there, particularly the interest of the airport, if you see that as a valuable asset to your community. Because if you've got a zoning overlay, and every time someone comes into that planning office to request a building permit, and it's located within that zoning overlay, then someone at the airport or representing the airport has to review it. If they're in that chain of approval process, then that's the way you prevent those issues from occurring, and you ensure that that 7460 is completed and completed accurately, and that you get a decision from the FAA before you issue that building permit.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, one final quick point on that, Ben. The original part of that question was, does that apply to everyone? And yes, it does. It extends out from every public airport that's listed in the National Airspace System.
We have a couple of follow-up comments regarding military uses. Randy points out DoD has a joint land use program that looks at noise for joint land use bases. So that's one resource to tap. And Thomas says, check out the land use compatibility plan prepared by the City of Virginia Beach, Virginia, and the U.S. Navy in response to the 2005 BRAC action. He says it proved to be very successful and is cited nationally as the standard for such programs.
Great. Thank you very much.
Question from Stephen. What remedies or powers does the FAA have if a developer ignores a finding that the proposed structure is an airspace obstruction and goes ahead and knowingly constructs it?
The power that
actually happened here at an airport that we know about, where the county went ahead and approved a cell tower, and after the fact, the cell tower was halfway constructed when the FAA came back with its determination that it was indeed a hazard to air navigation. And the answer is the FAA has no legal power because land use is a local issue. So in this case, the cell tower was constructed, and the airport has to take some unsavory steps, like increasing its approach minimums or rerouting aircraft to avoid that hazard.
Yeah, and that is exactly one of the most important parts of this presentation, is the fact that the FAA does not have the power, nor do they choose to enforce anything around the airport. That is entirely incumbent on the sponsors of the airport, and that is a part of the grant assurances that they expect those sponsors to keep that airspace clear. And every time you accept federal funds for development of that airport, you are promising that you will keep that airspace clear. And whether that be by zoning or, controlling building permits, whatever that process is. But that is the responsibility of the locality.
Yeah, and one of the wrinkles comes when the airport sponsor is not the entity that reviews and grants a building permit. So a lot of governments, like counties or cities, are the airport sponsor. But in other cases, a quasi quasi-political, like an authority, will be the airport sponsor, and in that case, they really have to work together to ensure that nothing slips through the cracks. So, one example, one of our clients in Virginia, the airport sponsor is an airport authority, and their review process for their county includes maybe 4 or 5 members of the county, including the airport manager who represents the authority. And this committee reviews all proposed development in the whole county to make sure that nothing slips through the cracks.
suppose that would be a beneficial result of having more robust county government, unlike what we have here in New England, where everything is done really at the local level. We have a question from Scott. Have there been any instances of noise complaint or strained compatibility of land use stemming from prolonged tarmac delays?
I'm only passenger complaints.
Yeah, right. Now, usually, you know, the any ramp holds that are done, even at the larger or more busy airports, they typically taxi them either to a taxiway or to a parallel taxiway or some remote parking pad, and the airlines always shut down at least one engine, if not shut the engine down completely, and use the auxiliary power unit, depending on how long they're going to be out there. Actually, the noise in that instance would be less than just an aircraft waiting to take off or to taxi, even though it would be a longer duration and more aircraft. Now, we're not aware of any that type of event that would worsen noise exposure.
Okay, thanks. Thomas asks, are you familiar with any situation where community evaluated the option of paying to protect airport expansion or simply relocate the airport farther away from the urban area? Kind of a cost-benefit analysis of two alternatives.
Yes, we have had, I'd say in the last 20 years, we have been involved with some new airports. We've also been involved with some that have actually relocated. I would say, I know in the, certainly within the last 20 years, we've been involved with 2, if not 3 airport relocations. But it's a very expensive process, and there's not much of that occurring these days that is receiving federal funding for it, you know. And even the ones that I'm thinking about, as I recall, like the land, for instance, was already owned by the city or the county. It was donated somehow, and there was, you know, there was some economic development reason that was driving it. As I recall, one instance, the land value for, you know, for where the airport was so significant that they could sell that land and just about pay for the relocation of the airport. So the FAA agreed to that and assisted in that process with some of the infrastructure development. But it was predominantly a self-financed effort.
And we have a question from Armando with an international flavor. Compared to the U.S. and other developed countries, are the noise and imaginary surfaces criteria at airports similar or more relaxed?
You know, it has been a while since I have referred to the ICAO references on that, but they are similar, yes. And I wouldn't say that they're, my recollection that they're significantly more relaxed, no. But there is an ICAO reference on that I would be glad to provide if someone's interested in it.
Okay, and last question we have time for. This is from Bonnie. What other presentation options or metrics does the FAA use to supplement DNL or to explain noise to the public?
Well, there's only one. DNL is the accepted metric to measure noise energy that the FAA uses. In California, they use a what is it called? CNEL, Roy Community Noise Equivalent Level metric.
That's correct, yes.
But that's really what FAA will use to describe, that's the accepted metric, and the idea is we use one metric across for every airport for consistency.
Right, and DNL is the national standard, and several decades ago the CNEL was adopted, and the FAA agreed to that because it was a state mandate and it was more restrictive than DNL.
Okay, that's great. That's all that we have time for. There are a few more questions which we will send to you, and I want to thank our speakers today, Mary Ashburn Pearson and Roy Lewis, for today's great presentation. For those of you who want to claim your CM credits, remember you can log in and look up under the Virginia chapter for the title of this program, Airport Land Use and Noise Compatibility, or you can search by the event number 902-8784. I'm Ben Frost for the Planning Webcast Series Consortium. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.